Let's move on to the French president's visit to China. French President Emmanuel Macron wrapped up a three-day trip to China in which he pulled out all the stops. Macron began his visit to Xian, the starting point of the ancient Silk Road. It was a nod to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the ambitious project to connect Asia, the Middle East, Europe and Africa through trade. In what the French president described as an unprecedented diplomatic gesture, he gave his Chinese host, President Xi Jinping, a horse from the French presidential cavalry corps. The two countries signed trade deals, and Macron signaled his desire for a long-lasting relationship with China, saying he plans to visit the country every year while in office. Well, let's get back to our panel now to talk about this. Leela, let me start with you. Let's move on to this visit. There was an economist at the French bank Natixis who said that President Macron is clearly eyeing a special strategic partnership with China. Is that what the French president is doing?
Well, Macron will definitely like that. The problem is, of course, that the French businesses in China are not quite as happy with a lot of the trade, the trade deficit for a start, with some of the, how difficult it is to do business in China. So, of course, when you have these visits, there's the protocol, there's the horse diplomacy. Macron's wife, Brigitte, is the godmother of a panda. So the charm initiative is on. But behind the scenes, there's, of course, the hard numbers. And it must be said that Macron is particularly good at this balance between charm and frankness, and in his, unlike Trump, he can cushion a pretty strong message in exquisite protocol, and he did not pull the stops on that. I mean, he talked about the trade deficit. Macron is also France is looking to China, Chinese investments in Africa, particularly in what they call the G5 Sahel initiative. This is the West Africa Security Initiative. And Macron spoke very pointedly about the mistakes that French imperialism had made in the region. And he noted that with China's Silk Route initiative, there is room for cooperation between France and China so that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. And that they pursue a path of justice and of fairness. So, this was a strong message, but was very subtly put.
Xindo, let's listen to what the Chinese President Xi Jinping had to say during the visit.
China supports France in playing a greater role in the process of European integration and welcomes greater contributions from France in the development of China-European relations.
So, Xindo, the business television network CNBC said President Macron may be trying to woo the Chinese, but China is also reaching out to Europe through its Belt and Road Initiative. So how important was this visit for the two countries?
Well, it is important in the sense of strengthening the ties between China and the European Union as a whole. And obviously, President Macron is taking advantage of, say, this difficulty in forming a coalition government in Germany, and also, Britain basically is mired in this Brexit long process of negotiation. So he, presented himself not only as the president of France, but also as an important leader of European Union. So he strengthened his position, and also by partnering with China, or trying to partner with China, I think that will bolster the global position of France. So obviously he's working for the benefits of national interests of France. But from the Chinese side of view, he talked about his support of the Belt and Road Initiative, signature project of President Xi Jinping. But at the same time, he balanced himself this should not be a one-way trade, everybody should be equal, things like that. So it's not completely happy, say, from the Chinese side of view. They see the warmth from the French side, but at the same time, they have a lot of reservations. He calls for the open market, open access to market, the Chinese market, the European market. At the same time, he also calls for tight screening of investment in European market, mostly targeting at the Chinese side. So I think people are clear of that.
Eleanor, if we look at the politics of this visit, President Macron clearly impressed his hosts with his grasp of Chinese history. He even spoke a few words in Mandarin. Those specific words were actually, let's make our planet great again. And we know where the inspiration for that came from. But in a general sense, is this leaving the United States playing a secondary role now?
I don't know if historically there's ever been a superpower that willingly withdrew from the world stage, but that's what the president is doing with his Let's Make America Great Again. And he views that as a commitment to draw in our borders, basically, and not pay so much attention to the rest of the world. He and Chinese President Xi got off to a wonderful start, but this President Trump is very impatient. And he was expecting the Chinese to really lean hard on the North Koreans and kind of help solve the standoff over their missile program. And that hasn't happened. And so the president kind of loses interest in these relationships. And so I think that Macron is stepping into what is a vacuum here, and he's very deft. He's very political. His father was greatly admired by many people in this country. I mean, he's obviously learned from the master. And I think we now have an emerging power in China and an assertive power in France moving in where the United States has now taken a back seat.
Actually, what's your view on that? I mean, as Eleanor says, the United States is now adopting a very inward-looking, introspective, America-first policy.
Right.
Do you see Europe moving closer to the East, given that the Americans are withdrawing?
I think that's definitely happening. And you know, look, at the end of the day, people can say what they want about trade deficits, but the China demand engine is a very important part of our global economy. And French exporters and German exporters and, frankly, American exporters, while President Trump may be looking inward, American companies are not looking inward. They're still looking at the great China demand engine. They're looking at the growth of the Chinese middle class. They are investing all across China. And yes, there are problems and market access issues. But you know, you cannot ignore the great China demand engine. And I think that what we're seeing is France catching up, frankly, to Germany and the United States and some other countries that have been looking eastward for a long time.
Right. Leila, looking at the trade relationship between France and China, let's listen to what President Macron had to say.
It's clear we will need to commit at the level of European heads of states and government to defining a common stance. I said it very clearly earlier, and I reiterated it to President Xi. I think that Europe, with respect to China, presented itself in too divided a manner.
So the point there that President Macron is making is that each member country of the European Union, if you like, is making individual separate deals with China. Do you see a time when the Chinese would make a deal with the European Union as a bloc?
Well, China would like to deal with, you know, European countries as a bloc. You know, China is particularly good in, as the French press reiterated time and again here, you know, China is very good at dealing with big countries. And, you know, the French media was not kidding its readers that France is a relatively small country compared to the US and India and other countries. But the thing is, China is also looks at the continent as, you know, Southern Europe and Northern Europe. And Macron, who now has this sort of interim king of Europe role until Germany, you know, German politics gets its act together, is trying to move in and bring the continent together. But, you know, this bloc is a divided bloc, especially between the Eastern European countries and the Western European countries. So, you know, so this was both these leaders talking about multilateralism, but really the devil is in the detail.
Shindo, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see China looking at Europe as a bloc, wanting to negotiate with Europe?
I think my colleague said it very well. Yes, China would very much like to deal with, you know, European Union as one bloc. It's easier, actually, in terms of investment and trade relationship. But at the same time, obviously, China is, you know, as like an alternative choice for some European countries. You know, what's the latest is like the Hungarian Prime Minister said that if they don't get money from the European Union, they can always look to China. So for some countries like China is always available there for investment, for more trade. Some countries probably are more open, like say to China's Belt and Road Initiative, like Greece. Not every European country is being kept at the same pace in terms of dealing with China. That's more about a European problem, like a divisiveness within the European Union bloc, instead of, say, like a China problem here.
Okay, we're going to move on to our final issue, and that is what President Trump has been saying about immigrants. It's been making news, not just in the United States, all over the world, but it's, of course, been wall-to-wall coverage here on cable news networks. Eleanor, there was this profanity-laden description of immigrants from African countries, from Haiti, from El Salvador. When I talk to people outside the United States, they want to know what's going on in the United States. Doesn't the president realize that words matter, that they count, they have an impact?
This president says whatever comes to mind, and the White House actually said that, well, these words would play well with what's known as his base, that this is what they think, and they would relate to this in the same way that they related to the president taking on the athletes who were kneeling instead of standing patriotically for the Star-Spangled Banner. So there is a segment of America that feels this way, but there's a much larger segment of America that doesn't feel that way and that is horrified. And the fact that it's dominated the news and it's now colored the negotiations on Capitol Hill to get legislation to protect the 800,000 kids known as dreamers who were brought here as children, I think it strengthens the Democrats' hand to get that deal.
So you see some good coming out of it?
I hope so. With this president, I hesitate to predict anything. He's so changeable.
Xian, it's provoked quite a big debate in the country and around the world about what this president says. There was a very, let me call it, provocative article in the New York Times, in the Washington Post today, an opinion piece written by a staff member of the Washington Post. And it was headlined, this was the headline, it said, "It's not just Trump. Western media have long treated black and brown countries like profanity deleted."
Right, yeah. Let's take that in two levels. On the one hand, I actually do think that when you look at Western media coverage of Africa, there has tended to be this what one might call poverty porn, right?
Yes.
And it's children with distended bellies, and it's and you never see an African middle class person in the coverage. You never. So there is something to be said for that Washington Post article. Having said that, if you take the Donald Trump statements, in a different level, obviously there's no defense for these statements, but it's also so politically naive for him to think that he can make a statement like this with senators and congresspeople and not think that it would somehow leak. I mean, Washington is so full of leaks that, this place is flooded by now. And the fact that he thinks he can make a statement like that without it leaking shows a certain political naivete. But to the first point, I do tend to agree. There has been some of that level of coverage in the Western media.
Right. I don't know, it's a bit unfair to blame the media.
The president is now denying he used those words, even though multiple people said he heard them many times. This is a man who came to prominence as a reality TV show star, and he was basking in the reviews of a summit he held on immigration on Tuesday, just thrilled that he was getting all this good coverage from the mainstream media who he likes to denounce. The next morning, when the reporters came to the White House, he said, "Welcome back to the studio." So he has us chasing shadows a lot of the time. And now I think the question is whether the Republican Party, which still controls the Congress, although just barely, whether they're going to be able to step up to the challenge of actually doing something about 800,000 kids who are hanging on every word, wondering what their future is going to be.
There is one explanation, Eleanor, that I've heard in Washington, and that is, look, we might, and this could refer to any president, we might not get the greatest president, might not be the most effective person, but they surround themselves with people who are competent. Do you see that here?
I don't think you can look at the White House staff and say that, and I don't think you can look at the cabinet and say that either. He has surrounded himself with yes people, and if people disagree, they're going to be gone. And some of the best and the brightest are not those people either. So he has such an arrogance about his own abilities and his own power. He doesn't seem to want anybody around him who can carry the ball down the field or who might overshadow him. And so I think it's a very dangerous time, but at least our institutions are holding. The Congress still has some investigations into the collusion with Russia. The courts are fighting back, and certainly the media is pressing on every day. So the president thinks, since he's president and he was elected in such an astounding way, that somehow he should have his way on everything, and that's not happening.
Leila, what does it look like from the other side of the Atlantic, this, let's say, colorful language that the president uses?
Well, before I get to how this is viewed, I just want to take up a point about how the media covers Africa. I was an Africa correspondent, and I actually found it was the other way, because the media now is talking about Africa as this huge market, Africa rising, and around me, I found Africans upset with the leaders that are not going anywhere. They're jumping onto boats and getting into Europe. So I really, I don't agree with this at all. In terms of how this is being viewed across outside of the US. I mean, what is really at stake here is that since World War II, America has had its influence without having to, its soft power, you know, without having to put money and troops. And America's influence, appeal is being lost across the world with Trump, and that really is at stake. Nobody seems to think America is the shining thing that it used to be. You know, there's definitely culture that the world is looking up to, but it is, you know, that shine is fading.
Shindo, how is this story being reported in China? I mean, is it big news there?
Yes, it's one of the big stories, and people are scratching their hands, you know, looking at the story, what's happening in the United States. You know, the United States used to be called the melting pot, so it's very open to immigrants from every country around the world. But now, obviously, U.S. is trying to close the door to some of the immigrants, at least. And also, you know, people see that as like a part of almost like a revolution, you know, happening inside the United States. Of course, it's the most domestic. U.S. is withdrawing from the international arena. U.S. is basically the administration, you know, is fighting against the political correctness. You know, is fighting against the immigrants from other countries. So U.S. is somehow like becoming like another country. You know, people are not seeing that clearly. And also there are comments saying that, you know, basically, decency, you know, we have a bottom line of conducting politics, either in the democracy or in whatever political system. And this is obviously not good.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and you know, one of the other things worth noting here, Anand, is both with the travel ban on Muslim countries and this colorful language, as you put it, you know, President Trump, what he's failing to do is distinguish between people and government. So if he genuinely does feel a certain government is, you know, insert colorful language, you know, you ought to, you feel that those people, you know, don't represent that government. And the ones who come here often do come here, and they are enterprising and plucky and have high levels of education, and really contribute to American life. And I think that's one area, one other area where he fails to distinguish between governments and people that actually live in those countries.
Well, in the legal briefs the administration presents to the courts, they are very careful to define his travel bans as not racially biased.
Right.
His language and his actions in office belie that, and the courts are going to take that into account. So he's undermining his own position.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being with us.